The moment I realized my family no longer saw me as a person, I was sitting at their Thanksgiving table holding a bowl of mashed potatoes no one had asked for. Around me, laughter filled the room. Conversations bounced from one side of the table to the other. Not a single person looked my way. When I quietly stood up, put on my coat, and walked out the front door, nobody stopped me. Nobody even noticed. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just leaving Thanksgiving dinner. I was leaving their lives forever. If you've ever felt invisible to the people you loved most, I'd love to hear your story. Please like and subscribe if stories like this speak to your heart. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Sometimes it's comforting to know we're not alone. 5 years before that Thanksgiving dinner, my husband David died on a rainy Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio. Sometimes I still remembered the sound of the hospital monitor going silent. Sometimes I still woke up expecting to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway. After 43 years of marriage, losing him felt like losing half of my own heartbeat. David had always been the center of our family. Not because he demanded attention, because people naturally gathered around him. He was the kind of man who fixed broken bicycles for neighborhood children and spent his Saturdays helping strangers move furniture. When he laughed, everyone laughed. When he hugged you, you felt safe. And when he died, something inside our family changed forever. At first, I thought it was grief. Everyone mourned differently. Jennifer, my daughter, threw herself into work. She lived in a large house outside Cincinnati with her husband Brian and their 2 daughters. Michael, my son, became distant almost overnight. He stopped calling regularly, stopped visiting, stopped asking how I was doing. For a while, I made excuses for them. They're hurting too, I told myself. Give them time. But time didn't heal what was happening. It revealed it. The first Thanksgiving after David passed away felt strange but manageable. The second felt lonely. By the third, I started noticing that family gatherings revolved around everyone except me. Conversations would stop when I approached. Decisions would be made without asking my opinion. Sometimes I felt less like a mother and more like an elderly relative everyone felt obligated to keep around. Still, I refused to give up. Family mattered to me. It always would. Every Thanksgiving morning, I continued the traditions David and I had built together over 4 decades. I woke before sunrise, made coffee, played old jazz records in the kitchen, prepared recipes that had been passed down through generations: sweet potato casserole, cornbread stuffing, green bean casserole, pumpkin pie, and David's favorite mashed potatoes. The recipe card still carried his handwriting. I touched it every year. It made me feel close to him. That Thanksgiving morning began the same way. I woke at 5:30. The house felt quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that reminds you you're living alone. I stood by the kitchen window while coffee brewed and watched snowflakes drift across the backyard. For a moment, I imagined David standing beside me, smiling, teasing me for worrying too much. "Everything's going to be fine, Renee." That was always his favorite sentence. Everything's going to be fine. I wished I still believed it. By noon, my kitchen smelled wonderful. The counters were covered with dishes. I had spent nearly 2 days preparing food for my family. Even though Jennifer had insisted she was hosting, even though nobody had asked me to bring anything, I brought food anyway, because that's what mothers do. We show love through effort, through sacrifice, through little things nobody notices until they're gone. Around 1 o'clock, Jennifer called. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." "Just making sure you're still coming." "Of course." "Okay, we're pretty busy here. See you later." Click. That was it. No asking how I was, no excitement, No warmth, just another item checked off a list. I stared at the phone after the call ended. The silence in my kitchen suddenly felt heavier. Years ago, Jennifer used to call me 3 times while cooking Thanksgiving dinner. She would ask questions, laugh, tell stories. Now I felt like an obligation squeezed between errands. I pushed the thought away. I didn't want negativity ruining the holiday. By 3 o'clock, I loaded everything into my SUV. The pumpkin pies, the casseroles, the containers of homemade cranberry sauce, the serving trays. Enough food to feed 15 people. As I carefully arranged everything, I noticed something strange. I couldn't remember the last time Michael had visited me without needing something. The realization hit me harder than I expected. Every recent visit had involved paperwork, questions about finances, questions about the house, questions about Dad's investments. Never questions about me. Never questions about my health, my happiness, my loneliness. Just business. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment and tried to shake the feeling. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe grief was making me sensitive. Maybe, but deep down, I knew something had changed. The hour-long drive to Jennifer's house gave me plenty of time to think. Christmases, birthdays, family vacations, soccer games, graduations. I had spent my entire adult life putting my children first. David and I worked extra jobs so they could attend good schools. We skipped vacations so they could have opportunities. We sacrificed things they would never even know about, and I would have done it all again, without hesitation, because that's what parents do. The problem was that somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing those sacrifices. They stopped seeing me. When I finally pulled into Jennifer's driveway, dozens of cars already filled the property. The house glowed with warm holiday lights. Laughter drifted from inside. For a moment, hope returned. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe I was imagining problems that weren't really there. Maybe we'd share memories about David. Maybe we'd laugh together. Maybe we'd feel like a family again. I grabbed the first casserole dish and headed toward the front door. The moment I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something odd. Nobody opened the door. Nobody greeted me. Nobody seemed to know I had arrived. Through the window, I could see everyone gathered inside, talking, laughing, celebrating. And somehow, despite being invited, I suddenly felt like a stranger standing outside my own family's life. I forced a smile onto my face and reached for the door handle. At that moment, I had no idea that before the night was over, I would discover a secret that would change everything I believed about my children. And I certainly didn't know that Thanksgiving would become the last day I ever sat at their table. I stood on Jennifer's front porch for several seconds before finally opening the door myself. The sound of laughter immediately poured into the cold November air. For a moment, nobody noticed me. The living room was crowded with relatives, neighbors, and friends. Football played on the television. Children ran through the hallway. Someone was carrying a tray of drinks. The entire house looked warm and welcoming. To everyone except me. I stepped inside carrying a heavy casserole dish. "Hello," I called out. A few people glanced in my direction. Then they returned to their conversations. No hugs, no excitement, no one saying they were glad I had arrived. Just a few polite nods. I forced a smile. Maybe everyone was distracted. Maybe I was overthinking things again. Then Jennifer finally appeared from the kitchen. "Oh, hi, Mom." She kissed my cheek quickly, the kind of kiss that felt more like obligation than affection. "Need help with those?" she asked. Before I could answer, she was already turning away. "We're running behind." Then she disappeared back into the kitchen. I stood alone holding the casserole. For a second, I felt ridiculous, like a delivery driver who had arrived at the wrong address. Eventually, I carried the dish into the kitchen myself. The counters were already crowded with food. I carefully placed my casserole beside several store-bought trays. No one commented on it. No one asked what I had brought. No one thanked me. I looked around. Brian was standing near the refrigerator talking to Michael. The moment they noticed me looking in their direction, both men became quiet. Too quiet. A strange silence passed between them. Then Michael forced a smile. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart. Happy Thanksgiving." "You too." That was the entire conversation. A few seconds later, he was talking to Brian again. Only now they were speaking in lower voices. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't one moment. It was the accumulation of hundreds of small moments, little reminders that I no longer belonged in the center of their lives. I drifted toward the living room. Ashley was scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up. "Hi, Grandma." "Hi, Ashley. Love your sweater." "Thank you." She immediately returned to her screen. Conversation over. Only Emma seemed genuinely happy to see me. My youngest granddaughter jumped up from the couch and wrapped her arms around me. "Grandma Renee." Her smile instantly warmed my heart. "There's my favorite girl. You always say that. Because it's true." She laughed. For a few minutes, we talked about school and her art classes. It was the first genuine conversation I'd had all afternoon. Then Jennifer called Emma into the kitchen, and once again, I was alone. As more guests arrived, the house grew louder. People gathered into groups. Stories were shared. Drinks were poured. I wandered between rooms searching for somewhere I fit. Somewhere I mattered. Somewhere I wasn't simply taking up space. Eventually, dinner was announced. Everyone moved toward the dining room. I followed behind. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then I looked at the table, and my heart sank. The dining table had been expanded to fit 12 people. Every chair was occupied. Every place setting carefully arranged. Except something was missing. My seat. For nearly 20 years, I had sat in the same spot during Thanksgiving. The chair beside David. After he passed away, Jennifer had continued placing me there. It had become a tradition, a symbol, a reminder. But this year, that seat belonged to someone else. One of Brian's business associates sat there laughing with another guest. I stood frozen for a moment. Maybe there was another chair. Maybe they had rearranged things. Then Jennifer noticed me. "Oh, Mom!" She pointed toward a small folding table near the kitchen doorway. "We set up extra seating over there." Over there. The words hit harder than they should have. At the small table sat 2 children and an elderly neighbor. It wasn't even in the dining room. It was practically in the kitchen, close enough to hear the family, far enough away not to be part of them. I stared at the chair, then back at Jennifer. For a brief second, I thought she might realize how hurtful this was. She didn't. She simply smiled and returned to arranging plates. I sat down quietly. Nobody protested. Nobody offered me a seat at the main table. Nobody even seemed to notice. From my position, I could see everyone laughing together. Michael sat near Jennifer. Brian was telling a story. The guests listened attentively. Meanwhile, I ate dinner with people who barely knew me. The humiliation settled deep inside my chest. Not because of the chair itself, because of what it represented. I had spent decades building this family, decades creating traditions, decades making holidays magical for everyone else. And now there wasn't even room for me at the table. Halfway through dinner, I decided I needed a glass of water. I stood and walked toward the kitchen. As I approached the hallway, I heard voices coming from Brian's home office. The door wasn't completely closed. I recognized Michael's voice immediately. "Once we sell the house, everything gets easier." I froze. "Sell the house," Brian answered. "I know." but timing matters. We've already waited long enough. Michael sounded irritated. Mom doesn't need that much space anyway. My pulse quickened. They were talking about a house. But whose house? Jennifer suddenly appeared around the corner. The office door immediately closed. The conversation stopped. Brian and Michael emerged seconds later, acting completely normal. Too normal. Brian smiled. Everything okay, Renee? Renee, not Mom, not even Mrs. Matthews. Just Renee. Like I was some distant acquaintance. Yes, I said quietly. Michael avoided eye contact. The knot in my stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. I knew it. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I found myself watching everyone more carefully, listening more carefully, looking for clues. Every time I approached a conversation, it seemed to change direction. Every time I entered a room, certain topics disappeared. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then it happened again, and again, and again. By the time dessert was being prepared, I felt less like a family member and more like an outsider accidentally attending a private gathering. Then I noticed something else. Michael and Brian kept exchanging glances. Concerned glances. The kind people share when they're managing a secret. A dangerous secret. I looked toward the dining room where family photographs lined the wall. One picture showed David standing beside me 20 years earlier, both of us smiling, both of us proud. Back then, this family felt unbreakable. Now, I wasn't so sure. As everyone laughed around me, a terrible thought entered my mind. What if this wasn't about grief anymore? What if this wasn't about growing apart? What if they were hiding something from me, something important, something involving a house? And for the first time all evening, I began to wonder whether David had seen this coming long before I did. By the time dessert was brought out, I felt emotionally exhausted. Not because Thanksgiving dinner had been difficult, because I had spent the entire evening pretending I wasn't hurt, pretending I hadn't noticed the missing seat, pretending I hadn't heard Michael and Brian discussing a house, pretending I didn't feel invisible. For years, I had been the one holding everyone together, the peacemaker, the organizer, the mother who remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every important date. Now I sat quietly near the kitchen while everyone else enjoyed the holiday I had spent decades helping create. Jennifer placed pumpkin pie slices around the table. Guests complimented the food. Several people praised the mashed potatoes. My mashed potatoes. The recipe David loved. The recipe I had spent an hour preparing that morning. No one mentioned that I had made them. No one even looked in my direction. I lowered my eyes and concentrated on my coffee. The pain felt embarrassingly childish. I was 68 years old. Why did I still crave my children's approval? Why did I still hope they would notice me? Maybe because mothers never stop being mothers, no matter how old their children become. Across the room, Ashley was speaking with several cousins. Emma sat beside her, scrolling through photos on her phone. For a moment, I watched them and remembered Jennifer at their age. She used to sit beside me during family gatherings. She used to tell me everything, her dreams, her fears, the boys she liked, the colleges she wanted to attend. Back then, I couldn't imagine a future where my daughter would look through me as if I were a stranger. Yet somehow, that future had arrived. A burst of laughter interrupted my thoughts. Brian was telling another story. Everyone seemed captivated. Even Michael was laughing. I noticed something else. Every time conversation drifted toward family history, or David, someone changed the subject. Almost deliberately, as if they wanted to avoid discussing the past, or perhaps avoid discussing something connected to it. The uneasiness in my stomach continued growing. Then something happened that changed everything. Ashley looked up from her phone. completely unaware of the tension around her, completely innocent, and asked a simple question. Grandma doesn't know about the assisted living place yet. The room froze. Every sound disappeared. Forks stopped moving. Conversations ended instantly. Even the football game playing on television suddenly seemed distant. I felt my heartbeat thundering inside my chest. Ashley looked around in confusion. What? Jennifer's face turned pale. Michael nearly dropped his coffee cup. Brian stared at the table. No one spoke. No one moved. I looked directly at Jennifer. What assisted living place? My voice sounded calm. Too calm. Jennifer swallowed. Ashley immediately realized she had said something wrong. Her eyes widened. Oh no. Jennifer, I repeated. What assisted living place? My daughter forced a nervous laugh. Mom, it's nothing. Nothing. That word, the favorite word of people hiding something. I set my coffee cup down carefully. Then explain it. Jennifer glanced toward Michael. Michael glanced toward Brian. The exchange lasted less than a second, but it told me everything. They had rehearsed this, maybe not the exact conversation, but the secret itself. Finally, Jennifer spoke. We were just discussing options for the future. What future? Your future. I stared at her. My future. Mom, you're getting older. There it was. The sentence every aging parent eventually fears. You're getting older. Not, how are you feeling? Do you need anything? Are you happy? Just a reminder that your age has become someone else's concern. I folded my hands in my lap. And what exactly have you been discussing? Jennifer looked uncomfortable. Michael stepped in. We've just been worried about you. Worried? Another interesting word. What specifically are you worried about? No answer came immediately. Finally, Michael said, You live alone. I've lived alone for 5 years. You're not getting any younger. The room remained silent. Every guest pretending not to listen. Every guest listening. I looked from Michael to Jennifer, then back again. Have either of you asked me whether I want to move into assisted living? Neither answered, because they already knew the answer. No, I said quietly. No, you haven't. Jennifer sighed. Mom, we were only exploring possibilities. Without telling me, we didn't want to upset you. The irony nearly made me laugh. The secret itself wasn't upsetting. The betrayal was. Before I could respond, Emma suddenly spoke. Grandma doesn't need assisted living. Jennifer shot her daughter a warning look. Emma. No, she doesn't? That's enough. Emma fell silent, but I noticed something important. The fear in Jennifer's expression. Not concern. Fear. As though she desperately wanted this conversation to end. The knot in my stomach tightened even further. Then another detail caught my attention. On the buffet counter behind Brian sat a folder. A simple blue folder, partially open. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I did. Because I could see a signature page sticking out. And something about it looked familiar. Very familiar. The handwriting, my handwriting, at least it appeared to be. I excused myself from the table and walked toward the counter. Immediately, Brian stood. Need something, Renee? Again, not Mom, not Mrs. Matthews. Renee. I pointed toward the folder. What's that? His reaction came too quickly, too defensive. Nothing important. He reached for the folder, but not before I caught a glimpse. A signature. My signature. At least that's what it looked like. I stopped breathing for a moment, because I knew something everyone else in that room didn't know. I had not signed a single legal document in months, not one. Yet there was my name, written in blue ink, attached to paperwork nobody wanted me to see. Brian quickly closed the folder. The movement was subtle, but it was enough. Enough to confirm my growing suspicion. Something was happening behind my back. Something involving paperwork. something involving property, and perhaps something involving that mysterious conversation about selling a house. I returned to my chair, my pulse racing. The room gradually resumed its conversations. People began pretending everything was normal again, but nothing felt normal anymore. I watched Jennifer laugh at something a guest said. I watched Michael avoid looking at me. I watched Brian keep the folder within arm's reach, and for the first time that evening, a frightening possibility entered my mind. What if this wasn't simply about putting me into assisted living? What if the assisted living discussion was only part of a much larger Plan A plan involving my finances, my property, my future? The more I thought about it, the more pieces began fitting together. The strange conversations, the missing seat, the secrecy, the talk about selling a house, the unexplained paperwork, the signature, my signature, or at least a version of it. Suddenly, I wasn't hurt anymore. I was alarmed, deeply alarmed. Because if someone had forged my name once, what else had they done? And who exactly was behind it? Michael, Brian, Jennifer, or all three? As dessert plates were cleared away and laughter filled the room once more, I realized something important. I was no longer sitting among family. I was sitting among people who were hiding something from me. Something big, something dangerous. And before this night ended, I intended to find out exactly what it was. I didn't confront anyone that night, not because I wasn't angry, not because I wasn't hurt, and certainly not because I was afraid. I stayed silent because something David used to tell me echoed in my mind. When people think you don't know the truth, Renee, they reveal much more than they intend to. For 43 years, my husband had been an excellent judge of character. At that moment, I decided to follow his advice. I smiled when people looked at me. I nodded during conversations. I accepted a second slice of pie I didn't want. And all the while, I watched, listened, waited. The blue folder never left Brian's side. That fact alone told me everything. Whatever was inside mattered. A lot. Around 9 o'clock, guests started preparing to leave. Coats appeared. Children grew sleepy. Goodbyes filled the house. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes after something inside you breaks. Jennifer was standing near the front door, thanking guests for coming. Michael was helping carry leftovers into the kitchen. Brian was speaking with a neighbor. No one seemed concerned about me. No one seemed interested in how I was feeling after the assisted living discussion. It was as if the entire conversation had never happened. As if my future had been discussed over dessert the same way someone might discuss football scores. I stood quietly in the hallway and looked at the family photographs hanging on the wall. There was one from Jennifer's wedding, another from Michael's college graduation, a Christmas portrait taken years ago. And then there was my favorite, a photograph of David holding Emma when she was a baby. His smile was enormous, his eyes full of love. I reached out and touched the frame. God, I missed him. More than anyone knew. More than I usually allowed myself to admit. Because David would have noticed. If I had been pushed to a folding table, he would have noticed. If our children had ignored me, he would have noticed. If someone had been planning something behind my back, he would have noticed. And suddenly, I felt very alone. Not just because my husband was gone, because I realized I had spent years pretending things were fine. Pretending the distance growing between me and my children wasn't real. Pretending every ignored phone call, every forgotten visit, every cold interaction didn't matter. Tonight had stripped away those illusions. The truth stood naked in front of me. I was no longer a priority in my children's lives. Maybe I hadn't been for a long time. I glanced toward the kitchen. Jennifer was laughing with Brian. Michael was checking something on his phone. None of them looked my way, not once. I quietly walked to the coat rack, removed my winter coat, put it on. No one noticed. I picked up my purse. Still, no one noticed. For a moment, I stood in the middle of the room, waiting. Not because I wanted attention, because some small part of me hoped one of my children would look up. Maybe Jennifer would say, "Mom, are you leaving already?" Maybe Michael would ask, "Are you okay?" Maybe someone would walk me to my car. Maybe someone would hug me. Maybe. But nobody did. The room remained full of voices, full of laughter, full of people. And yet, I had never felt more invisible. I opened the front door. Cold air rushed inside. Still, nobody looked up. I stepped outside. The door closed softly behind me. And that was it. No farewell, no goodbye, no one calling my name. Just silence. I stood on the porch for several seconds staring at the dark driveway. Then I began walking toward my SUV. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was leaving Thanksgiving, because I was leaving behind years of denial. The denial that my family still valued me the way I valued them. When I reached the vehicle, I placed my hand on the door handle. Then I turned around. The house glowed warmly against the darkness. From outside, it looked beautiful, a perfect family Thanksgiving. Anyone driving past would have seen happiness, tradition, togetherness. They would never have guessed what had happened inside. They would never have guessed a mother had spent the evening feeling unwanted in a family she helped build. A tear slipped down my cheek. I wiped it away immediately. I wasn't crying because I felt sorry for myself. I was grieving the family I thought I had, grieving the relationships I had spent decades protecting, grieving the realization that love isn't always returned equally. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away. Not one person came outside. Not one. The further I drove, the lighter I felt. Not happier, just clearer. The fog that had clouded my judgment for years was finally lifting. By the time I reached the interstate, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to go home. Home suddenly felt different. The conversations I'd overheard echoed through my mind. Once we sell the house, Grandma doesn't know about the assisted living place yet, the mysterious paperwork, the suspicious signature. None of it made sense. Yet, but I intended to find out. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. For a brief second, hope flickered inside me. Maybe Jennifer had noticed I was gone. Maybe she was worried. Maybe she wanted to apologize. The notification wasn't from Jennifer. It wasn't from Michael either. It was a promotional email. I laughed bitterly. Then another 20 minutes passed. No calls, no texts, nothing. Apparently, they still hadn't noticed. The realization hurt more than I expected. I had been gone nearly half an hour. Not one person had checked on me. Not one. Then I remembered something. Several months earlier, attorney Robert Hayes had called me. David's longtime attorney. The man who had handled nearly every important legal matter in our lives. At the time, Robert had said something unusual. "If you ever need me, Renee, call anytime, day or night." I hadn't thought much about it then. Now those words returned to me. Day or night. A strange instinct settled over me. Instead of taking the highway toward home, I exited onto another road. One leading toward downtown Columbus, toward Robert's office. The farther I drove, the stronger the feeling became. David had always trusted Robert, completely. If something suspicious was happening, Robert would know where to start. By the time I reached the city, it was nearly 10 o'clock. Most office buildings were dark. The streets were quiet. I parked outside a small brick building and sat in my vehicle for a moment. Part of me felt foolish. Another part felt absolutely certain. I took a deep breath. Then I grabbed my purse and stepped out into the cold night. What I didn't know was that before the night ended, Robert Hayes would hand me something David had left behind years earlier. Something that would change everything. Something my husband had prepared long before he died. And once I opened it, there would be no going back. The lights were still on inside Robert Hayes's office. That surprised me. It was Thanksgiving night, nearly 10 o'clock. Most people were home with family. But Robert had never been like most people. For over 30 years, he had been more than our attorney. He had been one of David's closest friends. The two men played golf together, argued about football, shared countless dinners with our family. If there was anyone David trusted completely, it was Robert. I walked through the front entrance feeling uncertain. The receptionist's desk was empty. A lamp glowed softly in the hallway. Before I could knock on Robert's office door, it opened. He looked older than the last time I had seen him. More gray hair, more lines around his eyes, but the concern on his face was immediate. Renee. His expression changed instantly. What happened? That question alone nearly made me cry. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the first time all day someone had looked at me and genuinely cared. I forced a smile. Happy Thanksgiving, Robert. He studied my face, then stepped aside. Come in. I followed him into the office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. It felt strangely comforting, like stepping into the past. Robert closed the door behind us. Tell me what's going on. For several moments, I couldn't speak, not because I didn't know what to say, because I didn't know where to begin. Finally, I told him everything. The missing seat, the conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the assisted living discussion, the folder, the signature, the talk about selling a house. Robert listened without interrupting. His expression grew more serious with every detail. When I finished, silence filled the room. Then he slowly leaned back in his chair. I was afraid of this. A chill ran through me. What do you mean? Robert looked toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner. For the first time that night, I saw a genuine sadness in his eyes. David prepared for this possibility. I stared at him. What possibility? That one day your children might see you as a source of assets instead of a mother. The words hit like a punch. I immediately wanted to reject them, to defend Jennifer, to defend Michael. But the events of the evening made that impossible. Robert stood, walked toward the filing cabinet, unlocked a drawer, then removed a thick manila envelope. My heart skipped. Across the front, written in David's familiar handwriting, were 5 simple words. For Renee, only if necessary. I stopped breathing. For a moment, it felt as if my husband had reached across time and touched my shoulder. I recognized the handwriting instantly, the slight slant, the careful lettering, the same handwriting on recipe cards and birthday notes, the same handwriting I had loved for decades. My fingers trembled as Robert placed the envelope in front of me. He left this with me 3 years before he died. I couldn't take my eyes off it. What is it? Robert sat down again. A contingency plan. A what? He instructed me not to give it to you unless certain circumstances occurred. I looked up. What circumstances? Robert hesitated, then answered quietly. If your children ever attempted to manipulate you, isolate you, or pressure you regarding family assets. My chest tightened. David had actually anticipated this years before his death. The idea seemed impossible, yet somehow not impossible enough. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several legal documents, and a flash drive. The letter sat on top. I unfolded the pages. The moment I saw the first line, tears filled my eyes. My dearest Renee, if you're reading this, then something has happened that I hoped would never happen. I had to stop reading for a moment. David's voice seemed alive inside every word. Robert quietly turned away, giving me privacy. I continued. You know better than anyone how much I love our children. Everything I did in life was for you and for them. But love should never blind us to reality. Over the last several years, I've noticed changes, small changes, conversations about money, questions about ownership, questions about inheritance, questions that arrived more frequently than concern for your well-being. I pray I am wrong. I pray this letter is never opened. But if it is, I need you to know something important. None of this is your fault. A tear slid down my cheek. I kept reading. You have always believed the best about people. That is one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But it also makes you vulnerable to those who mistake kindness for weakness. If anyone ever pressures you regarding property finances or your future, do not surrender out of guilt. Protect yourself. Protect your peace. Protect the life we built together. My hands were shaking now. Every sentence felt as though David were sitting beside me, speaking directly to me. The next paragraph changed everything. Most importantly, there are things regarding our assets that only Robert fully understands. I intentionally structured certain protections to ensure that no one could pressure you into decisions that are not in your best interest. Trust Robert. Trust the documents enclosed. And trust yourself. You are far stronger than you realize. Love always, David. By the time I reached the signature, I was crying openly. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears. The kind that come from grief and love colliding together. Robert handed me a tissue. Neither of us spoke for a while. Eventually, I looked at the legal documents inside the envelope. What are these? Robert exhaled slowly. The protections David mentioned. I wiped my eyes. What kind of protections? He opened a folder. There are several. The seriousness in his voice immediately got my attention. Before his death, David restructured portions of your estate. I frowned. Our estate? Yes. Robert pointed toward the paperwork. He wanted to ensure no one could force asset transfers without your direct authorization and multiple legal reviews. A strange feeling settled over me. Not fear, not exactly, more like awakening. For years, I had assumed David's estate planning was straightforward. Apparently, it wasn't. Apparently, he had anticipated risks I never considered. Why would he do that? Robert looked directly at me. Because he saw things. What things? He hesitated, then answered carefully. Years ago, Michael began asking unusually detailed questions about property ownership. I stared at him. Michael? Robert nodded. There were also concerns involving Brian. The room suddenly felt colder. Concerns. Financial concerns. I remembered Brian's nervous behavior that evening. The folder. The secrecy. The constant whispers. Suddenly, everything felt connected. Not fully, but enough to be frightening. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything. The Thanksgiving dinner, the assisted living discussion, the forged signature, David's letter, the protections, the warnings. All of it. And then a thought struck me. A terrible thought. What if they're already doing something? Robert's expression darkened. That's exactly what we need to find out. For the first time that evening, I realized this wasn't simply a family conflict. It might be something much bigger. Something involving deception. Something involving legal documents. Something David had tried to protect me from years before his death. And as Robert reached for another file sitting on his desk, I had a feeling the worst revelations were still ahead of me. For several minutes after Robert's last comment, neither of us spoke. The office felt unusually quiet. Outside, Thanksgiving night continued as normal. Families gathered around fireplaces. Children played with cousins. People laughed over leftovers and football games. Meanwhile, I sat across from my attorney, wondering whether my own children had been planning something behind my back. It felt surreal. Part of me still wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding, a reasonable explanation, a mistake. But another part of me remembered the look on Jennifer's face when Ashley mentioned assisted living. The panic, the fear, the guilt, those weren't the reactions of innocent people. Robert finally broke the silence. "What are you planning to do tonight?" I looked down at David's letter. "I don't know." "Do you feel safe going home?" The question startled me. Safe. I need to ask. I thought about it. Truthfully, I wasn't afraid of physical danger, not from my children. But emotionally, that was another matter. "I'm not sure." Robert nodded slowly. "As a precaution, I recommend waiting until we know more." The seriousness in his tone unsettled me. Before I could respond, my phone suddenly buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Jennifer. My stomach tightened. The call continued ringing. For a brief moment, I considered answering. Then I noticed the time. 11:17 p.m. I had left nearly 2 hours earlier. 2 hours. Only now had she noticed. I silenced the call. Seconds later, another call appeared. "Michael." Then another. "Jennifer again." Robert watched quietly. "They finally noticed you're gone." I stared at the screen. A bitter sadness settled inside me. Not because they were calling, because it had taken them so long. I imagined the scene unfolding back at Jennifer's house. Guests leaving. Dishes being cleaned. Conversations winding down. Someone finally asking, "Where's Mom?" And then the realization. The realization that I had vanished. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Jennifer. "Mom, where are you?" Another arrived immediately afterward. "Please call me." Then one from Michael. "We need to talk." Need, not want. Need. The distinction wasn't lost on me. For years, I had watched my son become increasingly selective about communication. When he needed something, he called. When he didn't, weeks could pass without hearing from him. Tonight felt no different. Only the stakes had changed. I placed the phone face down on the desk. Robert remained silent. He didn't need to say what both of us were thinking. The timing spoke for itself. Another message arrived. Then another. And another. The phone vibrated repeatedly. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I opened Jennifer's latest text. "Mom, please answer. We're worried." Worried. The word felt strange. Had they been worried when discussing assisted living without me? Had they been worried while hiding documents? Had they been worried when they pushed me to a folding table? I wasn't sure. A new message appeared. This one from Brian. "Renee, please call us immediately." My eyes narrowed. Not Mom, not Mrs. Matthews, Renee. Even in a crisis, he couldn't bring himself to address me as family. Robert noticed my expression. "What?" I handed him the phone. He read the message, then slowly returned it. Interesting. That's one way to describe it. My phone rang again. This time, Michael left a voicemail. A minute later, another arrived. Then a third. The urgency was growing, fast. I listened to the first message. "Hey, Mom, call me back when you get this." His voice sounded calm, almost casual. The second message arrived 20 minutes later. The difference was noticeable. "Mom, seriously, please call us." The third sounded entirely different. Now there was tension, frustration, maybe even fear. "Mom, where are you?" "We need to talk tonight." Need to talk. Again. Always need. Never love. Never miss you. Never how are you? Robert folded his hands. Do you notice the progression? I nodded. They sound nervous. Exactly. A chill moved through me. Something about their reaction felt wrong. If they were merely concerned about my well-being, the messages would sound different. Instead, they sounded increasingly desperate, as though something important depended on finding me. And quickly, my phone rang again. Brian, I ignored it. A text appeared immediately afterward. Please call. The paperwork needs to be discussed. I froze. Paperwork. There it was, the word none of them had intended to say out loud. I showed Robert. His jaw tightened. That's careless. I stared at the screen. Paperwork. Not are you safe? Not we're worried. Not we love you. Paperwork. The message lasted only a few seconds before Brian deleted it, but not before I had read it, and not before I had taken a screenshot. Robert actually smiled. Good. You think that's important? Very. For the first time that evening, I saw something close to certainty in his eyes. Whatever was happening, pieces were beginning to emerge. The mask was slipping. Meanwhile, my family seemed to be unraveling. Shortly after midnight, another call arrived, this time from Emma. I answered immediately. Grandma! Her voice sounded frightened. Hi, sweetheart. Oh, thank goodness. My heart softened instantly. Unlike everyone else, Emma sounded genuinely concerned. Not anxious, not desperate, concerned. Are you okay? Yes. Everyone's looking for you. I hesitated. Everyone, she lowered her voice. Grandpa Michael and Mom have been arguing. I frowned. Arguing about what? I don't know exactly. A pause followed. Then she whispered, Actually, I think I do. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? They keep talking about signatures. I looked at Robert. His expression darkened immediately. Signatures? And documents. A cold feeling settled in my chest. Emma continued. I wasn't supposed to hear them. What else did they say? Another pause. Then, Uncle Michael said if they don't find you soon, the deal can't happen. Deal. Not family. Not concern. A deal. I closed my eyes. The words hit harder than I expected, because deep down, I already knew what they meant. The calls. The panic. The sudden urgency. It wasn't about me. It was about something they needed from me, something they thought they already controlled. And now, I was missing, which meant their plans were suddenly in danger. Emma's voice trembled. Grandma, I'm here. Are you coming back? I swallowed hard. The question carried more weight than she realized. Because for the first time in my life, I honestly didn't know. Not to Jennifer's house. Not to the role I'd always played. Not to the version of myself that sacrificed everything while receiving less and less in return. I don't know yet, sweetheart. She was quiet. Then she said something that nearly broke my heart. I miss you already. Tears filled my eyes. Because after hours of manipulation, lies, and suspicion, one honest sentence felt overwhelming. I love you, Emma. I love you too. When the call ended, silence returned. Robert leaned back in his chair. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, he said, They aren't looking for you because you're gone. I stared at David's letter resting on the desk. No. I already knew. Robert nodded. They're looking for you because something they planned cannot happen without you. And as my phone continued vibrating with calls from Jennifer, Michael, and Brian, I realized a painful truth. For the first time in my life, my absence had become valuable to them. Not because they missed me, because they needed something only I could provide. And whatever that something was, I was beginning to suspect it involved far more than a simple house. I didn't go home that night. At Robert's recommendation, I checked into a small hotel near downtown Columbus. Not because I was hiding, because I needed time to think. Time to process everything that had happened in less than 24 hours. The ignored Thanksgiving dinner, the assisted living discussion, the suspicious documents, David's letter, the desperate phone calls, and now Emma's revelation about a deal that couldn't happen without me. Sleep came in short, restless fragments. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's handwriting. Protect yourself. Protect your peace. Protect the life we built together. By 6:30 the next morning, I was sitting across from Robert again. The holiday weekend had barely begun, but neither of us felt like waiting. Something was happening, and we both knew it. Robert arrived carrying several folders. A serious expression rested on his face, the kind attorneys wear when preparing to deliver unpleasant news. "Did you sleep?" "Not really. I didn't expect you would." He sat down and opened one of the folders. "There's someone I want you to meet." Before I could ask who, the office door opened. A tall man in his early 50s entered. Short brown hair, calm eyes, professional posture, the kind of person who immediately notices everything around him. "Renee, this is Daniel Brooks." The man extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Matthews." I shook it. "Likewise." Robert gestured toward a chair. "Daniel is a private investigator." That got my attention immediately. I looked from Daniel to Robert, then back again. "A private investigator." Daniel nodded. "Yes." My stomach tightened. I wasn't sure I liked where this conversation was heading. Robert folded his hands. "Several months ago, before Thanksgiving, you contacted me regarding some concerns." I frowned. I remember. At the time, my concerns had felt vague, hard to explain. Little things, uncomfortable feelings, strange comments from Michael, questions about property, questions about ownership, questions that seemed increasingly focused on assets rather than family. Nothing concrete, just intuition. "Based on those concerns," Robert continued, "I recommended Daniel." My eyes widened. Then I remembered. The phone call, the meeting, the conversation I had almost forgotten. Back in August, I had quietly agreed to let Daniel look into a few matters. At the time, I felt guilty, paranoid even. I had nearly canceled the arrangement twice. Now I was grateful I hadn't. Daniel opened a file. "What I'm about to show you isn't pleasant." The room suddenly felt colder. "I'd rather know the truth." He nodded. "That's usually the right answer." The first document slid across the table. A printed email. I immediately recognized Michael's name. My pulse quickened. "What is this?" Daniel pointed toward the screen captures attached to the report. "Communications obtained legally through public records, business disclosures, and other investigative methods." I began reading. Halfway through the first page, my stomach dropped. The conversation involved Michael and Brian. The topic, my house, not their house, my house. There it was in black and white. Estimated market value, possible sale price, projected proceeds. I looked up, unable to speak for a moment. Daniel quietly continued. "Those conversations began approximately 8 months ago." 8 months. I stared at him. 8 months. Yes. The realization hit me hard. While I had been calling my children, sending birthday cards, inviting them to dinner, they had already been discussing my property. For months. Daniel slid another document toward me. This one contained messages between Brian and an unidentified real estate consultant. The wording made my skin crawl. Once Renee transitions into assisted living, the process becomes significantly easier. Transitions, not moves, not chooses. Transitions, as though my life were a logistical obstacle, as though I were inventory. I pushed the document away. My hands were trembling. Daniel allowed me a moment before continuing. There is more. Of course there was. There always was. The next file revealed records of multiple meetings. Michael, Brian, a financial advisor, a real estate specialist. Several conversations centered around timing, strategy, documentation. One phrase appeared repeatedly: control of assets. I felt physically ill. Robert noticed immediately. You don't have to continue. Yes, I said firmly. I do. If my family had been planning something, I needed to see it all, no matter how painful. Daniel nodded respectfully, then opened another folder. This one contained something different. Photographs, surveillance photos, public locations, coffee shops, office buildings, parking lots, meetings, conversations. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. But together they told a story unfolding behind my back. One image showed Michael meeting with Brian outside a title company. Another showed both men entering a law office. A third showed them speaking with a real estate broker. The dates stretched back nearly a year. Nearly a year. I couldn't stop thinking about that. While I had been grieving David, adjusting to life alone, trying to maintain family traditions, they had apparently been building a plan, a long-term plan. Daniel placed the photographs aside, then looked directly at me. Mrs. Matthews, I need to ask you something. What? Have you signed any documents transferring ownership of your home? No. Any powers of attorney? No. Any authorization forms? No. Daniel nodded. As far as we can determine, that's accurate. The wording caught my attention. As far as we can determine, not simply yes, something more. Robert exchanged a glance with Daniel. A glance I immediately noticed. My stomach tightened again. What? Daniel hesitated, then slid one final document across the table. I looked down and felt all of the air leave my lungs. It was a copy of a signature page. My name appeared at the bottom. Renee Matthews. The signature looked remarkably convincing. Almost perfect. Almost. But not quite. Because I knew my own handwriting, and that signature wasn't mine. I stared at it, unable to speak, unable to breathe, unable to fully process what I was seeing. Daniel finally broke the silence. We believe this signature may have been forged. The room became very quiet. A forged signature. Not a misunderstanding, not speculation, not hurt feelings. A forged signature, a potential crime. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to deny it, to insist there had to be another explanation, but I remembered the folder at Thanksgiving. I remembered Brian hiding it. I remembered the panic, the secrecy, the whispers, the fear. Everything suddenly made sense, or at least more sense than before. What document is this attached to? Daniel answered immediately. A preliminary authorization connected to a property transaction. My heartbeat accelerated. Property transaction? Yes. Robert leaned forward. Which is why your disappearance last night created panic. I looked at him. What do you mean? Because if the transaction moves forward, additional signatures would eventually be required. The pieces finally connected. The frantic calls, the desperate messages, the urgency. It had never been about Thanksgiving. It had never been about family. It had never been about me. It was about a transaction, a plan, a timetable, and suddenly I wasn't cooperating. Daniel closed the file. There's one more thing. I braced myself. What? His expression became even more serious. The investigation suggests this wasn't Michael acting alone. I already knew the answer before he said it. Brian. Daniel nodded. In our opinion, Brian appears to be the primary driver. The room fell silent. I thought about Thanksgiving, The missing chair? The fake concern? The hidden folder? The constant whispers? Brian had been at the center of all of it, and for the first time, a new emotion appeared. Not sadness, not grief. Anger. Cold. Clear. Righteous anger. Because whatever mistakes my children had made, someone had helped guide them there. Someone had convinced them that I was an obstacle instead of a mother. And as I stared at the forged signature bearing my name, I realized something important. The woman who walked out of Thanksgiving dinner was not the same woman sitting in Robert's office now. The old Renee would have doubted herself. The new Renee wanted answers. And she intended to get every single one of them. For most of my life, I believed knowledge brought comfort, that if you understood the truth, you could handle it. I learned something different that weekend. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals, and sometimes it destroys illusions you never wanted to lose. The forged signature sat on Robert's desk between us, a simple piece of paper, yet it represented something enormous. Not merely deception, betrayal, because strangers had never done this to me. My own family had. I stared at the document for a long time, trying to reconcile it with the children I had raised. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. The little girl who climbed into my bed after nightmares. How had we arrived here? How had property become more important than trust? Finally, I pushed the question aside. There would be time for grief later. Right now, I needed facts. Robert seemed to sense the shift in my thinking. Good. I looked up. What? The way you're sitting. I frowned. What do you mean? You're no longer reacting emotionally. I glanced at the folders spread across the conference table. Perhaps he was right. For the first 24 hours, I had felt mostly shock. Now something else was taking over. Clarity. The kind David always seemed to possess during difficult situations. Tell me everything, I said. Robert nodded, then opened another file. Let's start with ownership. Ownership? The word suddenly felt very important. He pulled out several documents, property records, trust agreements, investment summaries, deeds, papers I had either forgotten existed or never fully understood. David had always handled the complicated financial matters, not because I wasn't capable, because we divided responsibilities. He managed investments. I managed daily life. It had worked for decades. Apparently, he had also been planning far ahead. Robert pointed to the first document. The family home. I immediately recognized the address. The house David and I had lived in for 36 years. The house where we raised Jennifer and Michael. The house everyone seemed so interested in. What about it? Robert slid the deed toward me. Whose name is listed? I looked carefully, then looked again. My eyes widened. Only one name appeared. Renee Matthews. Not David. Not David's estate. Not Michael. Not Jennifer. Mine. Exclusively mine. Wait. I looked up. I thought David and I owned it together. We did originally. Robert nodded. Several years before his death, David transferred full ownership to you. I blinked. I don't remember that. You signed the paperwork. I searched my memory, then slowly recalled the meeting, a stack of documents, a conversation about estate planning. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention. I trusted David completely. Apparently, I should have listened more carefully. Robert tapped the page. The home belongs entirely to you. A strange feeling settled over me. Not relief, empowerment. For the first time, I understood why certain people had become so interested in my future. I wasn't merely an elderly widow. I was the legal owner of a highly valuable property, and they knew it. Robert opened another folder. There's more. Of course there was. There always seemed to be more. He revealed paperwork connected to a small lakeside property. My eyes widened again. "The cabin," Robert smiled faintly. "You remember." Barely. Years earlier, David had purchased a small cabin several hours away. We used it occasionally for weekend trips, fishing, reading, escaping city life. After his death, I had almost forgotten it existed. "The cabin is also yours." I shook my head slowly. "In my name, entirely." My thoughts immediately returned to Thanksgiving, the conversation I had overheard. Once we sell the house? Which house? Now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe they wanted all of them. The family home, the cabin, anything they could access. Robert continued. "There are also investment accounts." My stomach tightened. Money had never interested me much. Security did, independence did, but numbers on statements rarely excited me. Today felt different. Today, those numbers represented freedom. Freedom from manipulation. Freedom from pressure. Freedom from people who viewed me as a transaction. Robert handed me another report. The balance was significantly larger than I expected. Much larger. I stared at it. "David never told me. He didn't want you worrying about money." That sounded exactly like David. Protective to a fault. Always carrying burdens quietly. Always making life easier for others. Even after death. Robert pointed toward several legal provisions. "These assets are protected through structures David established years ago." I studied the paperwork. Most of it seemed complicated, but one detail stood out immediately. Multiple approvals required, additional reviews, protective restrictions, barriers. David hadn't simply organized our finances. He had built walls around them, walls designed to protect me. The realization brought tears to my eyes. Even now, even years after his death, he was still looking after me. Robert allowed me a moment, then continued. "The most important thing to understand is this." I looked up. "No one can legally force you to transfer these assets." The statement felt surprisingly powerful. No one, not Michael, not Jennifer, not Brian, no one. For months, perhaps years, I had unconsciously acted as though my children possessed some authority over my future. Now, I understood the truth. They didn't. The only authority they had was the authority I gave them, and that realization changed something inside me. Daniel entered the room, carrying additional documents. "Sorry to interrupt." He placed another folder on the table. "What is that?" "More information about Brian." The atmosphere immediately shifted, because even before opening the folder, I suspected what we would find. Debt. The answer appeared on the first page. Substantial debt, credit obligations, business losses, personal loans, missed payments. I stared in disbelief. The numbers were staggering, far worse than I imagined. Daniel spoke carefully. "We believe these financial pressures may explain much of his behavior. Much of his behavior. Not excuse it, explain it. There was a difference, a very important difference." I studied the report. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. The urgency, the secrecy, the meetings, the pressure, the property discussions. A desperate man facing serious financial trouble might convince himself almost anything was justified, even exploiting family, especially if the reward appeared large enough. Robert folded his hands. "Do you understand now why they panicked when you disappeared?" I nodded slowly. For the first time, I truly did. My absence wasn't emotional. It was logistical. Their plan depended on access. Access depended on cooperation. Cooperation depended on me, and I was no longer cooperating. I thought about all the phone calls, all the texts, all the sudden concern. The realization felt heartbreaking, yet strangely liberating. Because once you stop believing a lie, it loses power over you. My phone buzzed again. Jennifer, still calling, still searching, still desperate. I stared at her name on the screen, then silenced the call. Not out of anger, out of clarity. For years, I had immediately responded whenever my children needed me, dropped everything, solved problems, offered help, made sacrifices. This time would be different. This time, I would learn the full truth first, then decide what happened next. David's letter rested beside me. The final line echoed through my mind. Trust yourself. You are far stronger than you realize. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I believed he might be right. Because the frightened woman who left Jennifer's house was gone. In her place sat a woman who finally understood something important. The house was never theirs. The assets were never theirs. The future was never theirs to control. And before this was over, everyone involved was going to learn that lesson, including me. The first thing I did Monday morning was call the bank. Not Jennifer, not Michael, not Brian, the bank. 3 days earlier, that decision would have felt extreme. Now it felt necessary. By then, I had spent nearly 48 hours reviewing documents with Robert and Daniel. Every hour seemed to reveal another uncomfortable truth. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dramatic enough for a television crime show. Just a steady accumulation of facts. Facts that painted a picture I could no longer ignore. My family had been planning around me instead of with me. And I was finished being the last person informed about my own life. I sat in Robert's conference room while a representative from my primary bank joined us by phone. The woman introduced herself politely, verified my identity, then asked how she could help. I glanced at Robert. He gave a slight nod. I'd like a complete review of every person with access to any of my accounts. The representative paused briefly. Of course. Several minutes later, she began listing information. Most of it was expected. Checking accounts, savings accounts, investment relationships, automatic transfers. Then she reached a section that made my stomach tighten. There are several authorized secondary access permissions. I sat up straighter. Secondary access? Yes. My eyes moved toward Robert. Who? The representative began reading names. The first wasn't surprising. David. Old authorization records that remained archived. The second name surprised me. Michael Matthews. I closed my eyes, slowly, carefully. Explain exactly what that means. The representative did. The permission wasn't ownership. It wasn't complete control. But it granted visibility, information, access to certain financial details, enough to monitor accounts, enough to understand balances, enough to know far more than I had realized. When was that established? The representative checked. Approximately 4 years ago. 4 years. I immediately remembered the circumstances. David had been sick. Michael had offered to help with paperwork. At the time, it felt harmless, responsible even. I never imagined it might become something else. Remove it. The representative didn't hesitate. Certainly. A strange feeling washed over me. Not revenge, not satisfaction. Something healthier. Boundaries. For perhaps the first time in years, I was creating them. When the call ended, Robert smiled slightly. How do you feel? I thought about the question. Lighter. And it was true. Each step felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. The next several hours followed a similar pattern. Financial institutions, legal reviews, document updates, authorization changes, nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just practical decisions. Yet each one mattered. Because every decision communicated the same message. My life belonged to me. By late afternoon, my phone rang again. Jennifer. I stared at the screen, then let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another call arrived. Michael, then Brian. I ignored them all. Not because I wanted punishment, because I wasn't ready. The truth was that every time I saw their names, conflicting emotions surfaced. Love, anger, disappointment, grief. No mother reaches 68 years old and simply stops loving her children. Even when they hurt her, even when they betray her, the love remains. That's what makes betrayal so painful. It has somewhere deep to land. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification, then another, then another. Finally, curiosity won. I listened to Jennifer's message first. Mom, please call me. Her voice sounded strained. We need to talk. Need again, not want, need. I moved to Michael's message. Mom, this situation is getting out of control. Interesting choice of words. Not heartbreaking, not emotional, administrative. Like a project encountering complications. Then I listened to Brian's. That one caught my attention immediately. Renee, there are misunderstandings that need to be cleared up. Misunderstandings. I almost laughed. The forged signature wasn't a misunderstanding. The hidden meetings weren't misunderstandings. The assisted living conversations weren't misunderstandings. They were choices, conscious choices, and someone had made them. Later that evening, Daniel called. His voice carried an energy I hadn't heard before. Are you sitting down? I immediately became alert. Why, I found something. The words sent a chill through me. What? A debt trail. I glanced at Robert. He was reviewing paperwork across the room. I placed the call on speaker. Daniel continued. Most of Brian's financial problems are worse than we initially thought. I wasn't surprised. But what came next was, there are business loans. Okay. Personal loans. Okay. A second mortgage. I frowned. On Jennifer's house. Yes. Silence filled the room. A second mortgage. I hadn't known. Apparently, Jennifer hadn't discussed it either. Daniel continued. Several of the debts appear connected to failed investment ventures. The picture was becoming clear. Painfully clear. Brian wasn't simply greedy. He was desperate. And desperate people often convince themselves that unethical decisions are temporary, necessary, justified, until those decisions destroy everything. What does this have to do with me? I already suspected the answer. Daniel confirmed it anyway. The value of your assets could solve most of their problems. There it was, the sentence nobody wanted to say aloud. My assets, not me. My assets. The distinction mattered, because for the first time, I could clearly see the motivation underneath everything. Not concern, not family planning, money. A painful sadness settled over me. I thought about all the Thanksgiving conversations, the whispers, the glances, the hidden documents. Every road seemed to lead back to the same destination. Money. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Eventually, Robert spoke. You're grieving. I looked up. Grieving? The image of your family. His words struck with uncomfortable accuracy, because that was exactly what I was doing. The facts hurt, but not as much as the collapse of belief. The belief that family always acted from love. The belief that good intentions existed underneath every mistake. The belief that loyalty naturally followed sacrifice. Life wasn't that simple. People were complicated. Even people we loved, especially people we loved. As evening approached, I made one final decision. Perhaps the most important decision yet. I called my insurance company, then my attorney, then several institutions connected to David's estate planning. One by one, I updated records, verified protections, added safeguards, strengthened barriers. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just prudent management. By the time I finished, any path toward transferring assets without my direct involvement had effectively disappeared. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt safe. Not physically, financially, legally, emotionally. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Jennifer, or Michael, or Brian. It was Emma. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." "Grandma." Her voice sounded relieved. "Yes. I was hoping you'd answer." I smiled. "I'll always answer your calls." A brief silence followed. Then she said something unexpected. "Mom and Dad are fighting." I exchanged a glance with Robert. "About what?" "I think money." Money. Again. "Always money?" Emma hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I heard Dad say everything is falling apart." My eyes narrowed. Everything. Not Thanksgiving, not family relationships. Everything. A plan, a strategy, something larger than I had originally imagined. As the call ended, I found myself staring out the office window. The sun was setting, the city lights beginning to appear, and for the first time, I realized an important truth. Thanksgiving hadn't destroyed my family. It had exposed it. The masks were slipping. The lies were unraveling. And somewhere underneath all the excuses and manipulations, the real motivations were finally coming into view. The question now wasn't whether there had been a plan. The evidence already answered that. The question was how far they were willing to go, and whether they understood that I was no longer the woman they thought they could control. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I disappeared. At least that's what my family believed. The truth was less dramatic. I hadn't vanished. I had simply stopped being available. For years, my life had been an open door. Anyone could call, anyone could visit, anyone could ask for my time, my help, my attention. And I always said yes. Now that door was closed, not locked forever. Just closed, long enough for me to breathe, long enough to think. Long enough to remember who I was before I became everyone else's solution. That was how I found myself driving north through winding roads on a cold December morning. The destination sat nearly 3 hours away, a small cabin hidden beside a lake. A place David had loved. A place most people had forgotten existed, including me. The cabin appeared through the trees shortly before noon. A modest structure. Weathered wood, stone chimney, wide front porch. Nothing luxurious, nothing flashy. Yet the moment I saw it, my chest tightened. Memories came rushing back. Weekend fishing trips, quiet mornings, drinking coffee with David, long walks beside the water, conversations about retirement, dreams about growing old together, dreams that never fully happened. I parked the SUV and sat quietly for several minutes. The lake shimmered beneath a pale winter sky. Snow covered the shoreline. The entire place felt untouched by chaos, untouched by betrayal, untouched by everything waiting back in Ohio. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something resembling peace. Inside the cabin looked exactly as I remembered. David's fishing rods still hung in the corner. Several old photographs remained on the shelves. A stack of books sat beside the fireplace. One of them still contained David's bookmark. I picked it up carefully, a receipt from a hardware store. 3 years old. For some reason, that tiny detail nearly made me cry. Grief works that way. Sometimes, it's not the big things. Sometimes, it's a forgotten receipt. A coffee mug, a jacket hanging in a closet, the evidence of ordinary life. I spent the afternoon unpacking, building a fire, making tea, watching snow drift across the lake. For the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. Nobody expected anything from me. The silence felt strange, then comforting, then necessary. That evening, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Jennifer, Michael, Brian. The pattern continued. Calls, texts, voicemails. I ignored them all. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wasn't ready to hear explanations. Explanations tend to arrive after people get caught. Truth arrives before. There was a difference. Around 7 o'clock, another call appeared. Emma. I answered immediately. Hi, sweetheart. Her relief was obvious. Oh, good. How are you? I've been worried. Unlike everyone else, she sounded sincere. No agenda, no hidden purpose, just concern. The kind families are supposed to show each other. I'm okay. Where are you? I smiled. Somewhere peaceful. She laughed softly. That sounds nice. It is. A pause followed, then her voice lowered. Things are bad here. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? Everyone keeps fighting. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. About what? Mostly you. I stared into the fire. Me. Dad keeps arguing with Mom. The words immediately caught my attention. Brian and Jennifer. The center of everything. What are they arguing about? Emma hesitated, then answered carefully. Money? There it was again. Always money. I felt a wave of sadness, because every new revelation seemed to lead back to the same place. Not concern, not love, money. Emma continued. I wasn't trying to listen. I know, but I heard Dad yelling. My stomach tightened. What did he say? Another pause. Then he said everything was supposed to be finished already. Finished. The word lingered in my mind. Finished, as though some process had been interrupted, some plan delayed. What else? He said you ruined everything. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because the statement hurt, because it confirmed something. A person doesn't say you ruined everything unless they expected something specific to happen, something valuable, something important. And now it wasn't. Emma's voice softened. I'm sorry, Grandma. None of this is your fault. I know. But she sounded unconvinced. Like many children, she carried responsibility that didn't belong to her. I changed the subject. Asked about school, her artwork, friends, normal things. For a few minutes, the conversation felt wonderfully ordinary. Then she said something unexpected. There's something else. The seriousness in her tone immediately got my attention. What is it? I think you need to know. I leaned forward. The fire crackled softly beside me. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, my pulse quickened. What happened? Emma took a deep breath. Last week before Thanksgiving, Mom and Dad had people over. I listened carefully. Who? I don't know. Okay. They were talking in Dad's office. My heartbeat accelerated. The office. The same office where I had overheard conversations during Thanksgiving. The same office where secrets seemed to gather. I wasn't trying to listen. Again, the apology of a child caught between loyalty and truth. It's okay. I heard Uncle Michael, too. That got my attention immediately. What were they discussing? Emma lowered her voice. The house. I wasn't surprised, but I remained silent, letting her continue. They kept saying your name. A chill moved through me. And they said once everything was signed, things would be easier. Signed. There was that word again. Signatures, documents, approvals, everything connecting back to the same place. The forged paperwork, the property discussions, the desperation. Then Emma said something that changed everything. I recorded part of it. The room seemed to stop. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. What? I recorded part of the conversation. I sat completely still. You did. Just by accident at first. My pulse thundered. Emma, I was recording a video for a friend. She sounded nervous. I didn't know it mattered. The fire popped loudly. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked, "Do you still have it?" "Yes." My mind raced. A recording, not rumors, not assumptions. A recording, actual evidence, something concrete, something real. "I can send it." I exchanged a glance with nobody, just stared into the flames. Because suddenly, the situation felt different. Not emotionally, strategically. Until now, most of what we had uncovered came from documents and investigations. Useful, important, but indirect. A recording could be something else entirely. A window into the truth. Raw, unfiltered, unintended. "Would you be willing to send it to me?" "Of course." I smiled sadly. "Thank you, sweetheart." After we ended the call, I sat quietly for a long time. The lake outside had disappeared beneath darkness. The cabin remained warm, safe, still. Yet my thoughts raced. Emma, the recording, the conversations, the house, the signatures, the plan. Every road seemed to be converging toward a single destination. The truth. And for the first time, I suspected that the evidence my family feared most wasn't hidden in bank records, or legal files, or property documents. It might be sitting on a teenager's phone, waiting to reveal exactly what had been said when they believed nobody was listening. The video arrived the next morning. I stared at the notification on my phone for nearly a full minute before opening it. Not because I was afraid of technology, because I was afraid of what I might hear. Some truths are easier to suspect than to confirm. The file wasn't very long. Just under 7 minutes. 7 minutes that would permanently change the way I saw my family. I immediately forwarded it to Robert, then Daniel. Within an hour, all three of us were sitting together in Robert's office. The video rested on a laptop in front of us. Nobody spoke. Finally, Robert pressed play. The footage was shaky, clearly recorded unintentionally at first. The camera pointed toward the floor. Occasionally, furniture appeared in frame. Voices echoed from another room. Brian's office, exactly as Emma described. The recording began with ordinary conversation. Background noise, people moving around. Then a familiar voice appeared. "Michael, we can't keep waiting forever." My stomach tightened. Brian answered immediately. "I know." The room fell silent as we listened. The conversation continued. No context, no introductions, just people speaking freely because they believed nobody important was listening. Michael sounded frustrated. "She's not going to volunteer." Volunteer. An interesting word. Not agree, not choose, volunteer. As though my cooperation were a problem. Brian sighed. "That's why we need another approach." Another approach. The phrase made my skin crawl. Robert paused the video. Nobody spoke for several moments. Then he restarted it. Jennifer's voice entered the conversation. "I don't like this." For the first time in weeks, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Maybe Jennifer had opposed everything. Maybe she had tried to stop it. Maybe the next sentence destroyed that hope. "I just don't want her finding out." Not, "I don't want to do this." Not, "This is wrong." Not, "Stop." She didn't object to the plan. She objected to being caught. My chest tightened. The video continued. Brian spoke next. "Once the paperwork is complete, none of this matters." The room became very still. Paperwork. Again, always paperwork. Always documents. Always signatures. Robert paused the recording once more. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Neither man looked surprised, only disappointed. I understood why. The evidence wasn't dramatic. It was worse. It was authentic. People speaking honestly. People revealing themselves. The video resumed. A few seconds later came the statement that changed everything. Michael laughed softly, then said, "If we can prove she's confused, things become much easier." The words seemed to suck the air out of the room. Confused, not elderly, not vulnerable. Confused, a legal word, a strategic word, a dangerous word. I stared at the screen, unable to move, unable to blink, unable to fully process what I had just heard. Robert paused the video. Again. Silence filled the office. Finally, I spoke. "What does that mean?" His answer came immediately. "It means they were discussing capacity." My stomach dropped. Legal capacity, mental competence, the ability to make decisions, the ability to control property, the ability to say no. Everything suddenly made sense. The assisted living conversation, the secret meetings, the forged signature, the pressure, the urgency. They weren't simply trying to influence me. They were discussing ways to remove my authority entirely. Daniel leaned forward. "The wording is extremely concerning." Extremely concerning. The investigator's version of a warning. Robert resumed playback. The conversation grew even worse. Jennifer sounded nervous. "What if she refuses?" Brian answered immediately. "Then we'll have to move faster." Move faster, not reconsider, not stop. Move faster. The confidence in his voice chilled me because it suggested planning, preparation, momentum. This wasn't a spontaneous discussion. This was a strategy already underway. Then came another voice. Michael again. "Once the house is sold, most of the problems disappear." There it was. The house. The center of everything. The object around which all these conversations seemed to revolve. The object worth sacrificing relationships for. Worth manipulating family for. Worth lying for. Worth betraying a mother for. The video ended shortly afterward. No dramatic confession. No criminal mastermind speech. Just ordinary people discussing extraordinary selfishness. And somehow, that hurt more. When the screen went dark, nobody moved. For several moments, all I could hear was the faint hum of the laptop. Finally, Robert closed it. "Well?" One word, yet it carried enormous weight. Daniel broke the silence first. "This changes things." I nodded slowly. Because it did. Until now, much of what we had discovered could be explained away. Misunderstandings, bad judgment, poor communication. Not anymore. The recording revealed intent, not perfectly, not legally conclusive, but emotionally, it revealed everything. I sat quietly, trying to process it, trying to reconcile those voices with the people I loved, because that was still the hardest part. I love them, even now, even after everything. Love doesn't disappear on command. If only it were that easy. Eventually, Robert opened another folder. "What happens next?" I looked up. The question hung between us. What happens next? A month earlier, I would have answered differently. I would have avoided conflict, protected feelings, made excuses, accepted explanations. Not anymore. I thought about Thanksgiving, the folding table, the ignored arrival, the conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the fake concern, the hidden documents, the video, David's letter, everything. Then I made a decision. "I want to meet them." Both men looked surprised. "Are you sure?" Robert asked. "Yes?" "You don't have to rush." "I'm not rushing." I already knew that. The decision felt calm, certain, necessary. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking truth. There was a difference. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "If we do this, it should happen here." I nodded. "Agreed." Neutral territory, professional environment, witnesses present. No shouting matches inside someone's kitchen. No emotional ambushes, no manipulation, just facts. Robert opened his calendar. "We can arrange that." For the next hour, we discussed logistics, dates, documentation, evidence, legal considerations, practical matters. Yet beneath all of it, another reality existed. Soon I would be sitting across from my children, looking them in the eyes, hearing whatever explanation they chose to offer. Part of me dreaded it. Another part looked forward to it, because uncertainty is exhausting. At least the truth allows movement. Eventually, as the meeting ended, Robert handed me a document. I recognized it immediately, an amendment, related to my estate plan, my trust, my beneficiaries. I looked up. What is this? A choice. I studied the pages. Everything suddenly felt very real. For years, I had assumed my estate would pass automatically to my children. Now I understood something important. Inheritance is not entitlement. It is trust. And trust can be broken. Robert spoke carefully. You don't need to decide today. I nodded, but part of me already had. Not specific details, not exact distributions, something deeper. The understanding that my future would no longer be dictated by guilt, or obligation, or fear. As I left the office that afternoon, snow drifted gently through the air. The world looked peaceful, beautiful, even. Strange how life works that way. Chaos inside, calm outside. I stood beside my car for several moments, thinking, remembering, grieving, healing. Then I climbed into the driver's seat, because the next chapter was coming. The confrontation, the meeting, the moment when secrets would finally be brought into the open. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 10 days after Thanksgiving. 10 days after I walked out of Jennifer's house without anyone noticing. 10 days that felt like 10 years. I arrived at Robert Hayes's office 15 minutes early. Not because I was nervous, because I wanted a moment alone, a moment to breathe, a moment to remember why I was there. The conference room was large and professional. A polished wooden table occupied the center. Legal folders sat neatly arranged at one end. Several bottles of water had been placed around the room. Everything felt calm, orderly, controlled, unlike the emotions waiting to enter through the door. Robert sat beside me. Daniel occupied a chair near the wall. Neither man spoke much. There wasn't much left to say. The evidence existed. The decisions had been made. Now came the truth. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. Jennifer entered first. The moment I saw her, my heart broke a little. Because despite everything, she was still my daughter. Still the little girl whose nightmares I used to chase away. Still the teenager who cried in my arms after her first heartbreak. Still someone I loved. And that made everything harder. Michael followed behind her. He looked exhausted, older, stressed. Brian entered last. His expression immediately shifted when he noticed Daniel sitting in the room. Interesting. Very interesting. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched, heavy, uncomfortable. Finally, Jennifer broke first. Mom. Her voice trembled. I nodded politely. Jennifer. Tears instantly appeared in her eyes. For years, that sight would have shattered my resolve. Not today. Today, I needed truth more than tears. Everyone sat down. The room became silent again. Robert folded his hands. Thank you all for coming. No one responded. Jennifer looked directly at me. We've been worried sick. The statement lingered in the air. I considered it carefully, then answered honestly. No. Confusion crossed her face. What? You've been worried about something? I held her gaze. But I don't think it was me. Her eyes immediately shifted away. The reaction spoke volumes. Michael cleared his throat. Mom, this has gotten completely out of hand. I almost smiled. Out of hand. Another interesting phrase. As though the problem wasn't the deception. The problem was that the deception had been discovered. Robert opened a folder. I think we should begin with facts. The atmosphere changed immediately. Everyone straightened slightly, especially Brian. Robert placed several documents on the table. Property records, financial records, copies of communications, evidence. Nothing dramatic, just truth. And truth can be devastating. Michael looked at the paperwork, then at Robert. What exactly is this? A review of recent events. Brian leaned back, already defensive, already uncomfortable. Good. For years, I had been the uncomfortable one. Now it was their turn. Robert began calmly. We have evidence of discussions regarding Renee's property. No one spoke. We have evidence of conversations regarding assisted living. Still, silence. We have evidence of attempts to obtain legal control over assets. Jennifer's face grew pale. Michael stared at the table. Brian remained motionless. Then Robert placed the video transcript in front of them. That finally got a reaction. Brian's jaw tightened. Jennifer looked terrified. Michael closed his eyes. They knew, immediately. They knew exactly what it was. The room remained silent for several moments. Then Jennifer whispered, "Oh my God." Not because she was shocked, because she was caught. I felt a surprising sadness. Not satisfaction, sadness. Because there is nothing joyful about watching your children realize they can no longer hide. Robert continued. The recording contains several statements that require explanation. Nobody volunteered one. So he provided the first example. If we can prove she's confused, things become much easier. The words echoed through the room. Jennifer began crying. Michael looked physically ill. Brian remained silent. I watched all three carefully. Not one person denied saying it. That mattered. A lot. Robert continued. Once the paperwork is complete, none of this matters. Still silence. Once the house is sold, most of the problems disappear. The room felt smaller, heavier, more difficult to breathe in. Finally, I spoke. The first words I had directed toward them all morning. Which house? Everyone looked at me. I repeated myself. Which house were you planning to sell? Michael swallowed hard. Jennifer wiped her eyes. Brian answered first. A mistake. A very big mistake. Renee! No. I raised a hand. His mouth closed immediately. You don't get to call me Renee. The room became silent. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in Brian's eyes. Good. I continued. You spent months discussing my future without me. My voice remained calm, steady, controlled. You discussed moving me into assisted living. No one responded. You discussed my property. Still silence. You discussed proving I was confused. Jennifer began crying harder. I looked directly at her. Did you ever once ask me what I wanted? Her shoulders collapsed. No. The answer barely escaped her lips, but it was enough. No. One word. One devastating word. Because it contained the truth. No. They hadn't asked. Not once. I turned toward Michael. Did you? He stared at the table. No. Another truth. Another wound. Then I looked at Brian, the architect, the man at the center of so much. What about you? His expression hardened. For the first time, defensiveness replaced fear. We were trying to help. The sentence almost made me laugh. Help. Such a beautiful word. Such an ugly excuse. Help me, I asked quietly. Or help yourselves? Silence answered for him. Robert slid another document across the table. Brian immediately recognized it. The debt report. The color drained from his face. Now everyone knew. Jennifer looked at the numbers, then looked at her husband. What is this? Brian didn't answer. She looked again. What is this? Still silence. Then realization appeared. Slowly, painfully. The second mortgage, the loans, the business debts, everything. Jennifer stared at him as though seeing a stranger. Tears stopped. Shock replaced them. You told me we were fine. Brian looked away, and in that moment, everything unraveled. Not because of me, because lies rarely survive sunlight. Michael finally spoke. His voice sounded defeated. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I looked at him. The little boy who once brought me dandelions. The grown man sitting across from me now. Then, how far was it supposed to go? No answer came. Because there wasn't one. Only regret. And regret arrives too late. After several moments, Jennifer spoke, her voice barely audible. I was angry. The confession surprised everyone, including her. I remained silent, letting her continue. After Dad died, tears returned. Everyone talked about how much he loved you. The room became still, very still. I know that sounds ridiculous. She laughed bitterly through tears. But I was jealous. I blinked, not because I understood, because I never expected those words. Jennifer wiped her face. He always chose you first. Pain filled her expression. And I hated that. The confession felt honest, raw, unexpected. Perhaps for the first time that morning, not an excuse, a truth. An ugly truth, but a truth. Michael stared at his sister in shock. Brian looked away, and I sat there realizing something heartbreaking. This wasn't only about money. Money had accelerated everything, but underneath it existed years of resentment, insecurity, jealousy, weakness, unhealed wounds, human flaws, the kind that destroy families when left unattended. I looked around the room, at my children, at the evidence, at the damage. Then I realized something important. The confrontation wasn't really about proving who was guilty. We already knew. It was about deciding what happened next. And that decision belonged to me. The room remained silent after Jennifer's confession. No one seemed to know what to say next. Not even Robert. For several moments, all we could hear was the soft hum of the heating system. I looked around the table, at my daughter, my son-in-law, people I had loved for decades, people I still loved, and people who had hurt me more deeply than anyone else ever could. The strange thing about betrayal is that anger eventually runs out. What remains afterward is grief. Pure grief. Not only for what happened, for what could have been, for what should have been. I folded my hands together. Then I spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. When your father died, I lost the love of my life. Nobody interrupted. I lost my best friend. Jennifer wiped her eyes. Michael stared at the table. I continued. And after that, I spent years trying to hold this family together. Memories flooded my mind. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, hospital visits, graduations, phone calls, family dinners, thousands of little acts of love, thousands of sacrifices nobody ever saw. I kept inviting everyone over. My voice trembled slightly. I kept calling. No one moved. I kept showing up. I looked directly at Jennifer, even when you stopped. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Then I turned toward Michael. Even when every conversation became about paperwork, his eyes filled with shame. I wasn't trying to hurt him. The truth was doing that on its own. Finally, I looked at Brian. The silence between us stretched. Long, uncomfortable, necessary. You saw me as an asset. He immediately shook his head. No. I held up a hand. Don't. The words stopped him. Because we both knew. The evidence had already spoken. The recordings, the meetings, the debts, the forged signature, everything. There was nothing left to argue. For the first time since entering the room, Brian looked genuinely defeated, not angry, not defensive. Defeated. And perhaps that was appropriate, because every plan he had built was collapsing. Not because I destroyed it, because it was wrong from the beginning. I took a deep breath, then reached into my folder. Several documents rested inside. Documents Robert had prepared. Documents I had reviewed repeatedly. Documents that represented a decision. The most important decision of my life. I slid them across the table. Jennifer frowned. Michael looked confused. Brian immediately recognized what they were. Trust documents, estate documents, beneficiary amendments. The room became very still. Robert quietly explained. Renee has made changes. No one spoke. Jennifer's face paled. Michael looked stunned, and for the first time I realized something important. Months ago, this moment would have terrified me. Now it didn't. Because I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of clarity. There was a difference. A huge difference. I looked directly at my children. You spent months making decisions about my future. My voice remained calm. So now I'm making decisions about it myself. Jennifer began crying again. Mom, no. I shook my head gently. You need to hear this. She fell silent. Everyone did. For years, I believed love meant endless forgiveness. I paused. I was wrong. The room remained silent. Love without boundaries becomes permission. That sentence seemed to land heavily, especially with Jennifer, especially with Michael. I continued. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. More silence. You can forgive someone and still refuse to let them hurt you again? I looked down at the documents, then back at them. That's what I'm doing. Nobody argued. Nobody denied it, because there was nothing left to deny. Eventually, Michael spoke. His voice sounded broken. What happens now? The question lingered. What happens now? For days, I had been asking myself the same thing, and now I finally knew the answer. I'm leaving. Jennifer stared at me. What? I'm leaving. The words felt surprisingly peaceful, not painful, not dramatic, peaceful. Michael blinked. Leaving where? I smiled faintly. For once in my life, I don't need to tell anyone. That wasn't cruelty. It was freedom. A freedom I hadn't experienced in decades. Jennifer shook her head. You can't mean forever. I considered the question carefully, then answered honestly. Not forever. Relief flashed across her face. For a second, then I finished. But things will never go back to the way they were. The relief disappeared, because she understood. We all did. The old relationship was gone. Trust once broken doesn't magically reappear. It must be rebuilt. Slowly, patiently, honestly. And that process hadn't even begun. I turned toward Michael. His eyes were red. I love you. The statement surprised him. Perhaps because he expected anger, punishment, hatred. Instead, he got truth. I will always love you. Tears filled his eyes. But loving you doesn't require me to surrender my dignity. He lowered his head, unable to respond. Then I looked at Jennifer. The daughter I once believed would always be my closest friend. I love you too, she cried openly, but I continued. You don't get to decide my future. Another truth, another boundary, another necessary wound. Finally, I reached the last document. The one decision I had made with absolute certainty. I slid it forward. Robert smiled softly. He already knew. Jennifer looked confused. Michael looked confused. Brian looked terrified. Only Robert understood immediately. "What's that?" Jennifer asked. I smiled, for the first time that day, a genuine smile. "A gift." She frowned. "A gift?" I nodded. "To the person who treated me like family." Silence filled the room. Then realization slowly appeared. "Emma." Jennifer's eyes widened. Michael leaned back in his chair. I continued. "Emma never asked me for money." Nobody spoke. "She never asked about my property." Still silence. "She never discussed my capacity." Jennifer closed her eyes. "She simply loved me." The room became quiet again. Beautifully quiet. Because nobody could argue with that. Nobody. I wasn't disinheriting everyone. I wasn't acting out of revenge. But I was recognizing character. And character matters. Especially when money enters the room. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Not dramatically. No screaming. No threats. No theatrical exits. Just truth. Painful truth. Necessary truth. As everyone stood to leave, Jennifer approached me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry." The words sounded genuine, for the first time. I believed her. Not enough to erase the past, but enough to hear them, enough to accept them. I hugged her, briefly, then stepped away. Michael hugged me too. His shoulders shook slightly. I held him for a moment, then let go. Brian never approached. Perhaps he understood there were no words left. Perhaps he knew some damage takes years to repair. Maybe longer. As I walked toward the door, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because everything was fixed. Because it wasn't. Not because justice felt satisfying. Because it didn't. I felt lighter because I had finally chosen myself. After a lifetime of choosing everyone else, and as I stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, I realized something important. The woman who left Thanksgiving dinner unnoticed was gone. In her place stood a woman who finally understood her worth. A woman who no longer needed permission to live her own life. 1 year later, I stood in a kitchen filled with laughter. Real laughter. The kind that reaches people's eyes. The kind that isn't hiding secrets. The kind that doesn't disappear when someone enters the room. Outside Thanksgiving morning, sunlight filtered through the windows of my home in North Carolina. The scent of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh bread filled the air. Music played softly from a speaker near the counter. And for the first time in many years, I felt completely at peace. If someone had told me a year earlier that I would be spending Thanksgiving hundreds of miles away from Ohio, I would have laughed. Back then, my entire identity revolved around family. Not the healthy kind of family. The exhausting kind. The kind where your worth becomes tied to how much you sacrifice. The kind where your needs always come last. The kind where you slowly disappear while convincing yourself it's love. I didn't understand that at the time. Now I did. After the meeting at Robert's office, I made a decision. A real decision. Not an emotional reaction. Not a dramatic escape. A choice. I moved to North Carolina, not because I was running away, because I was moving toward something. Toward peace. Toward freedom. Toward a life I had postponed for decades. David and I had visited North Carolina several times during our marriage. We always loved the slower pace, the mountains, the lakes, the friendly people, the feeling that life didn't have to be rushed. After he died, I often imagined what retirement there might have looked like. Eventually, I stopped imagining and started living. The first few months weren't easy. There were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, moments when I wondered whether I had made the right decision. Change is difficult at any age, perhaps especially later in life. But something unexpected happened. Without all the chaos, I began hearing my own thoughts again. I started reading more, walking more, smiling more. I joined a community center, volunteered twice a week, met people who knew nothing about family drama, property disputes, or betrayal, people who simply enjoyed my company, people who valued me for who I was rather than what I owned. That alone felt revolutionary. One afternoon, I met a widow named Carol during a volunteer event, then another woman named Susan, then a retired teacher named Helen. Friendships formed naturally, not because anyone needed something, because we genuinely enjoyed being together. It reminded me that family isn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it's defined by kindness, respect, consistency, the things my old life had been missing. The Thanksgiving gathering I hosted that year reflected that lesson. Some guests were friends. Others were widows and widowers from the community. A few were people who simply had nowhere else to go. One gentleman had lost his wife 2 years earlier. Another woman had no surviving relatives. A retired veteran arrived carrying a homemade pie. Everyone brought something. Everyone contributed. Everyone belonged. Nobody sat at a folding table in the corner. Nobody felt invisible. That mattered to me, more than anyone realized. As I checked the turkey in the oven, my phone buzzed. A message. I already knew who it was. Jennifer. For a long moment, I stared at the screen. A year earlier, seeing her name would have filled me with anxiety. Now it filled me with something else. Acceptance. Not complete healing, but acceptance. Our relationship had changed dramatically after the meeting. The first few months were difficult, painful conversations, awkward silences, honest apologies, slow rebuilding. Trust wasn't restored overnight, nor should it have been. But effort mattered, consistency mattered, and to Jennifer's credit, she kept trying. The message was simple. Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. I love you. I smiled, then replied, Happy Thanksgiving. I love you too. Because despite everything, love remained. Love had survived. Trust needed rebuilding, but love survived. A second message arrived moments later. Michael, Happy Thanksgiving, Mom. The message continued. Thank you for giving us a chance to do better. I stared at it for a while, then smiled. Because that was all I had ever wanted. Not perfection, growth, accountability, honesty. I sent a short response. Happy Thanksgiving, Michael. The truth was that the previous year had changed him too. The financial crisis forced difficult conversations, difficult truths, painful lessons. For the first time in years, he stopped viewing me as someone who would always rescue him. And strangely enough, that improved our relationship. Boundaries often do, not because they create distance, because they create respect. The front door opened. A familiar voice filled the house. Grandma? My face instantly lit up. Emma. She rushed into the kitchen and wrapped her arms around me. I hugged her tightly, longer than usual, because some people deserve extra gratitude, and Emma certainly did. She had visited several times throughout the year, sometimes alone, sometimes with Jennifer. Her honesty had changed everything, not because she exposed secrets, because she chose integrity, a rare quality, a valuable one. She stepped back and smiled. Something smells amazing. I laughed. Good answer. She grinned. You taught me well. Maybe I had, maybe not, but I knew one thing. Emma had become the living reminder that character matters more than inheritance, more than money, more than property, much more. The afternoon passed quickly. Guests arrived. Food was served. Stories were shared. Laughter echoed through the house. At one point, I stepped onto the back porch alone, just for a moment, just long enough to look at the mountains in the distance. The air felt crisp, clean, peaceful. I thought about Thanksgiving 1 year earlier. The ignored conversations, the folding table, the silent departure, the heartbreak, the betrayal, everything. And then I thought about where I stood now, surrounded by people who appreciated me, living a life I chose, free from guilt, free from manipulation, free from the need to earn love through sacrifice. A strange realization settled over me. I wasn't grateful for what happened. I would never be grateful for betrayal, but I was grateful for what it revealed. Because sometimes losing the wrong table allows you to find the right one. The old Thanksgiving table had been built on obligation. This one was built on respect. The old table made me feel invisible. This one made me feel seen. The old table belonged to the life I thought I needed. This one belonged to the life I actually deserved. Inside, someone called my name. Dinner was ready. I smiled and turned toward the door, toward warmth, toward laughter, toward people waiting for me. Not because they needed something, because they wanted me there. And as I walked back inside, I realized that leaving Thanksgiving dinner unnoticed had not been the end of my story. It had been the beginning of a life where I finally understood my worth. A life where love and respect existed together. A life where I no longer sat at someone else's table hoping to be seen. I had built my own table, and everyone gathered around it knew exactly who I was. There is a lesson hidden inside every painful chapter of our lives, but sometimes we are too hurt to see it until much later. For many years, I believed being a good mother meant always saying yes. I believed sacrifice was the highest form of love. I believed that if I gave enough, forgave enough, and endured enough, everything would eventually work out. Life taught me something different. Love without respect cannot survive. Kindness without boundaries eventually becomes permission for others to take advantage of you. And forgiveness does not require you to accept repeated harm. Growing older does not make you less valuable. It does not make your voice less important. It does not mean your dreams, your peace, or your future belong to someone else. No matter your age, you have the right to make your own choices. You have the right to protect your dignity. You have the right to walk away from people who only notice your value when they need something from you. Most importantly, it is never too late to begin again. Sometimes the life waiting for us is on the other side of a difficult goodbye. Sometimes the people who truly appreciate us are not the ones we expected. And sometimes losing what we thought we needed creates space for something far better. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your self-respect? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about family resilience, healing, and emotional justice, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means so much. No matter where you're watching from today, remember this. You deserve to be loved. You deserve to be respected. And you are never too old to start a new chapter.